Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Europe is at a critical juncture in its history. The American shield is slipping away. Ukraine risks being abandoned. Russia strengthened. Washington became the court of Nero, an incendiary emperor, submissive courtiers, and a buffoon on ketamine, tasked with cleaning up the civil service. This is a tragedy for the free world, but it is first and foremost a tragedy for the United States. Trump's message is that there is no point in being his ally, since he will not defend you, he will impose more tariffs on you than his enemies, and he will threaten to seize your territories while supporting the dictatorships that invade you. The king of the deal is showing what the art of the deal is flat on his stomach. He thinks he will intimidate China by lying down in front of Putin. But Xi Jinping, faced with such a shipwreck, is undoubtedly accelerating preparations for the invasion of Taiwan. Never in the history of the United States has a president surrendered to an enemy. No one has ever supported an aggressor against an ally. No one has ever trampled on the American Constitution, issued so many illegal executive orders, dismissed judges who could prevent it, fired the military staff at once, weakened all checks and balances, and took control of social networks. This is not an illiberal drift, it is the beginning of the confiscation of democracy. Let us remember that it took only 1 month, 3 weeks, and 2 days to bring down the Weimar Republic and its constitution. I have confidence in the strength of American democracy, and the country is already protesting. But in 1 month, Trump has done more harm to America than in 4 years of his last presidency. We were at war with a dictator. We are now fighting a dictator supported by a traitor. 8 days ago, at the same time that Trump was patting Macron's back in the White House, the United States was voting at the UN with Russia and North Korea against the Europeans, demanding the departure of Russian troops. 2 days later, in the Oval Office, the doc plan of the military service gave lessons in morals and strategy to war heroes Zelensky, before congenering him as a groom. By ordering him to submit or resign tonight, he took another step into infamy by stopping the delivery of promised weapons. What to do in the face of this betrayal? The answer is simple. Face up and first, do not make a mistake. The defeat of Ukraine would be the defeat of Europe. The Baltic states, Georgia, and Moldova are already on the list. Putin's ultimate objective is to return to a Yalta-like agreement where a significant portion of the continent was handed to Stalin. The nations in the south await the conflict's resolution to decide whether to continue respecting Europe or feel free to disregard it. What Putin seeks is to dismantle the order established 80 years ago by the United States and its allies, particularly the ban on acquiring territory by force. This idea is at the very source of the UN, where today the Americans vote in favor of the aggressor and against the attacked, because the Trumpian vision coincides with that of Putin. A return to spheres of influence with big powers dictating the fate of small countries. To me, Greenland, Panama, and Canada. To you, Ukraine, the Baltics, and Eastern Europe. To him, Taiwan and the China Sea. It is called in the evenings of the oligarchs of the Gulf of Mar-a-Lagos. Diplomatic realism, we are therefore alone. But the discourse according to which Putin cannot be resisted is false. Contrary to Kremlin propaganda, Russia is in trouble. In 3 years, the so-called second army in the world has only managed to grab crumbs from a country 3 times less populated, interest rates at 25%, the collapse of foreign exchange and gold reserves, the collapse of democracy show that it is on the brink. The American boost to Putin is the biggest strategic mistake ever made in a war. The shock is violent, but it has a virtue. Europeans emerge from denial. They understood in one day in Munich that the survival of Ukraine and the future of Europe are in their hands, and that they have 3 imperatives: accelerate military aid to Ukraine, to compensate for the American slaughter, for it to hold and, of course, to impose its presence and that of Europe in any negotiation, it will cost a lot. We must end the taboo on the use of frozen Russian assets. It will be necessary to bypass Moscow's accomplices within Europe itself by a coalition of only the willing countries with of course, the United Kingdom. Second, demand that any agreement be accompanied by the return of kidnapped children, prisoners, and absolute security guarantees. After Budapest, Georgia, and Minsk, we know what agreements with Putin are worth. These guarantees require sufficient military force to prevent a new invasion. Finally, and this is the most urgent because it will take the most time, we must rebuild European defense, neglected in favor of the American umbrella since 1945 and scuttled since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The task is monumental. However, the success or failure of this endeavor will determine how today's democratic European leaders are remembered in history. Friedrich Merz recently stated that Europe must develop its own military alliance. This acknowledges France's long-standing argument for strategic autonomy. A substantial investment will be necessary. Strengthen the European Defence Fund beyond the Maastricht debt criteria, harmonize weapons and ammunition systems, accelerate mutual assistance in the Union of Ukraine, which is today the leading European army, rethink the place and conditions of nuclear deterrence based on French and British capabilities, relaunch anti-missile and satellite shield programs. The plan announced yesterday by Ursula von der Leyen is a very good starting point, and much more will be needed. Europe will only become a military power if it becomes an industrial power again. In a nutshell, the Draghi report will have to be implemented for good, but the real rearmament of Europe is its moral rearmament. We must convince public opinion in the face of weariness and fear of war, and especially in the face of Putin's cronies, the extreme right and the extreme left. Yesterday in the National Assembly, Mr. Prime Minister, they again argued before you against European unity. Against European defense, they say they want peace. What neither they nor Trump say is that their peace is capitulation, the peace of defeat, the replacement of de Gaulle, Zelensky by a Ukrainian Petain at Putin's boot, the peace of the collaborators who have refused for 3 years any aid to the Ukrainians. Is this the end of the Atlantic Alliance? The risk is great, but for a few days. But in the past few days, Zelensky's public humiliation and all the crazy decisions taken over the past month have ended up making the Americans react. The polls are falling. Republican elected officials are welcomed by hostile crowds in their constituencies. Even Fox News is becoming critical. The Trumpists are no longer in majesty. They control the executive, parliament, Supreme Court, and social networks. But in American history, the supporters of freedom have always won. He begins to raise his head. The fate of Ukraine is being decided in the trenches, but it also depends on those in the United States who want to defend democracy and here on our ability to unite Europeans to find the means of their common defense and to make Europe the power it once was in history and which it hesitates to become again. Our parents defeated fascism and communism at the cost of all the sacrifices, the task of our generation. To defeat 21st century totalitarianism, glory to a free Ukraine, glory to democratic Europe.